very easily if you go through the global resources route, from fisheries and lumber and timber and wildlife and soils and all those sorts of things. When you study ecology, you recognize that the Earth can be considered to have a single global ecosystem. And it's incumbent upon those of us that live on the Earth to try to care for that global ecosystem. So over the last 200 years, some rules have been produced that give us a pretty good idea as to fundamentals of how it all works: carbon cycle, hydrological cycle, that sort of thing. And so when we have that sort of background, then it's easy to go from the biology to the politics of it, to go from global economies or global ecologies into global studies and global responsibilities. So that's kind of how you get there. Well, it's obvious, I think, Jay, that the function of a mentor is to serve as a kind of a exemplar, kind of a model of appropriate behavior. And if the mentor can do nothing else, the mentor can be a person who provides a pretty good description of what a moral person, what an ethical person ought to be. Now, some of my heroes, as I've become increasingly older and presumably more knowledgeable, are family women. And I believe that women are incredibly important to society because they are the glue, the cement, the foundation that keeps things together. The men are out watching football or doing politics or whatever, but the women are doing, in my view, the real work of the continuation of the culture and the society. But in addition to women, I would have to say my primary heroine, of course, is my wife, Dee Granholm. And I also look upon my 3 sons, their wives and their grandchildren, as models or perhaps heroes of mine as well. Before I branch off into other, what you might call more famous individuals. Then one moves into, I suppose, in a profession like mine, my colleagues, my academic colleagues. And I have the highest respect for teachers. And I've had some of the most interesting and worthwhile experiences with my university colleagues as well as teachers in the schools in which my children have attended. And then I suppose we can move on to other particular types of mentors. But where do you want to go at this point, Jay? Well, depending upon the relationship between the mentor and the individual, some of the time it's a professional relationship. For example, when I used to do research at the University of Minnesota, I worked with a clinician there. And he was a superb molecular biologist as well as an excellent physician. He taught me a whole series of techniques on how to conduct biological assays on variables important to pigment cell biology, which were important to concepts of melanomas, what causes melanomas, and how they can be treated and cured. One day I went to see this clinician and arrived at his office, and I went into his office and I found him crying. And I said, "What is the problem?" And he said, "I've had this patient now for 30 years and she died." So now there was an example of a mentor that not only was superb in the laboratory, but also an excellent physician and a caring human being. Now, I might say the same thing about Dr. Rick Holm. He, to me, is a mentor, and I've enjoyed knowing him over the years. And I want to tell you about one particular example. About 20 years ago, I had a very nasty staph infection, and I was sick in the hospital. And Dr. Holm realized that I was in the hospital, and even though he wasn't my physician, he did a medical workup, and he collaborated with my physician, and he did what he could to help me. And I obviously survived, and I was very happy for his participation. In addition, Dr. Holm has come to my classes at the university to help me with my discussion of medical ethics. And it's really nice to have someone on board who is in the heart of the practice of medical ethics. We can talk ad nauseum about the theory of medical ethics, but as one of my other mentors, Dr. Joseph Pellegrino at Georgetown University, told us once, When you're in the operating room, you have to make a decision. You don't have time to have these long, protracted ethical debates about what's right. So one has to appreciate both the theory as well as the practice. And Dr. Holm, as well as Dr. Pellegrino and others, have helped me with the practice aspects of ethics. I think one of the things that I used to like to do more than anything else in my bioethics class at the university was to read a Platonic dialogue called The Apology. And in that story, Socrates is accused of a crime, namely corrupting the youth, and he's brought to trial. Even though the sentence which is handed down to Socrates is absolutely inappropriate, because all he was charged with is corrupting the youth and antagonizing the citizens of Athens, he was tried and convicted of the crime and sentenced to death, and he was told he had to drink the hemlock. So in another dialogue, his friend Crito comes to see him and offers up a whole series of excuses why he shouldn't have to die. Socrates refutes every one of them, and he says to Crito, I've been a citizen of Athens, I've lived by the laws of Athens, then even though I'm falsely accused, it would be inappropriate for me at this stage of my life to violate my fundamental beliefs in the laws of Athens. So to get back at your basic question, a really strong code and excellent set of principles allows one to live an ordered life. It may not always be the happiest of lives, but it is an ordered life and a life of meaning. And as the old saying goes, at the end of the day, you have to look at yourself in the mirror, and hopefully you see something in the mirror that is somewhat respectful and respectable. Well, I don't look upon myself as purposefully as a mentor, but I know I've acted in that role. And what I've attempted to do is provide a model of excellence in whatever ways I can. For example, having students in the research laboratory, I'd like to get in there and conduct the research with the students, help them with their experimental design. In the teaching classroom, I'd like to do the best job I can possibly as a teacher, provide the information in an objective manner, and allow for lots of discussion, and be very respectful of the student. One of the things that teachers often have a problem with is they don't understand where the student is at that particular time. For a student might ask a question or might behave in a way which the professor might appear to be aberrant. However, the professor doesn't know the conditions under which the student is living at that time. And students, like everyone else, have a difficult time from time to time, and it's important that professors be cognizant of that. Well, I think what you need to do, Jay, is you need to look at the fundamental principles under which they operate. Each one of those gentlemen has a set of primary principles and motivations. They come from very different parties. They have very different party principles. Yet they both, in their heart, believe that what they are doing is the best possible thing they can do. So it's up to the electorate, and this is where we fall down as citizens. It's up to the electorate to require our leaders to explain their positions and elaborate upon their principles. If upon that elaboration they make sense to us, then we should support them. If they don't make sense to us, then we should support other candidates. But I guess the thing I'd like to convey more than anything else is that they're both principled individuals. We may differ with regard to their principles, but they're operating out of what they consider to be a moral, principled position. Well, let's take a look at General Petraeus, for example. Up until his recent indiscretion, he was very much of an excellent model, looked upon by all military personnel and many others as, one might say, an epitome of what it is to be a general, a military person, a warrior. During the course of his activity with his interviewer, he made had a moral lapse. On the news this morning it said his moorings came loose. Now, we as the public have to consider whether or not we would be willing to forgive him for his moral lapse. Now, the question is, how many of us are perfect human beings? How many of us make mistakes? Perhaps not as egregious as that mistake, but perhaps even more egregious in some instances. And so we all have to look upon ourselves as considering the possibility of forgiving people for what they've done and giving them another chance. It's a difficult question, Jay, and I'm not sure exactly how we should go with people that are in a position of influence or power like General Petraeus. But in general, I think it's morally incumbent upon us to consider people as human beings and understand their weaknesses and be willing and try as best we can to forgive them. The person being mentored has a responsibility to become a mentor himself or herself. And in many instances, the quality of that mentorship is directly related to the quality of the mentor that one works with. A lot of it has to do with one's basic upbringing and family values and other ways of seeing the world. If a person is open, generous, honest, he or she is susceptible to becoming a good mentor, a good citizen. And that makes it all the easier for that person to become a role model in the future. Generally speaking, a person has to have a bit of experience and perhaps a little bit of wisdom to become an effective role model. One of the things that I've always been curious about is the difference between intelligence and wisdom. I think there can be lots of very, very intelligent people who have, by virtue of inexperience, little wisdom. And there are others that, by virtue of experience and a moderate amount of intelligence, can have a lot of wisdom and can provide that wisdom to others in a mentor relationship. There are two things I'd like to say about that, Jay. One is when I was doing global studies, my two fundamental principles that I tried to emphasize were, how does one become an authentic global citizen? Excuse me, an authentic global citizen. And secondly, how can one achieve what I called cultural competency? Cultural competency is the ability to look at another culture and value that culture, respect that culture. Now you put that on one hand, that cultural competency, and you contrast that with the ethical theory of relativism, which states that in my own group, in my own society, in my own culture, as long as I behave the rules and the standards and regulations and principles of my culture, that's all well and good. But I shouldn't be making comments about another person's culture. So if I find something going on in another culture which is wrong to me, I'm in no position to make comments about it because that's that other culture, that's their culture. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there are certain standards of behavior that go across the board. So when we look at all cultures, including our own culture, we have to apply these fundamental rules of what are the primary principles that guide humanity, that guide what it is that we as human beings are supposed to be about. And if we view our culture, which has its lapses, as well as other cultures, then we have to ask those fundamental and probing questions. That is, do those particular principles, can they be universalized? Can they be ones that we could adopt and we could live with in our own cultures? To me, it's a very difficult situation. And one of the things that brings that to the fore at the moment is the Supreme Court decision. And I think I talked to my colleague, Dr. Bob Burns, who knows a lot about constitutional law, and he informed me that it is an extremely complex situation. And I don't quite know what's going to happen with regard to the Supreme Court, and none of us will know until June or so. But here again, we have this very emotional response from many people about this particular phenomenon, and it's awfully hard to sort out what's right and what's not right. From a biological perspective, it's pretty straightforward. From a social perspective, it may not be so straightforward. I guess, Jay, you have to boil it down to whatever laws and principles you live with. Your moral principles are on the one hand, and then your legal requirements on the other. So the constitutional case going on right now with gay marriage is a very important part of that, because that's going to form the legal basis for sharing of estate matters and for Social Security monies. And I heard on public radio today that there are over 100 different sort of benefits that the government provides to married couples that they don't provide to gay couples who aren't married. So you have the societal kind of question. But I guess, Jay, what you really need to do is boil it down to what is right. And again, I get back to this concept of universalizing principles. So if you can elaborate a set of fundamental principles that can be adopted and used by people of many different cultures, then maybe you're getting closer to coming up with a set of principles that might work for all human beings. But the marriage question and the gay marriage question is a very difficult one. And I have the utmost feeling and passion for gay couples. And I would like to think that they could have the kinds of rights that married people have. But it's in the courts and it's in society, and it will have to play out. I think one way you get at that question, Jay, would say that the more power a person has, perhaps the more responsibilities they have to exercise that power appropriately. And society delegates powers to the various members, and physicians, lawyers, clergy, and other people have a considerable amount of power. And they're respected people. And when they say something, people pay attention to them. And so I would like to respond to your question by saying that physicians do have perhaps a greater responsibility than the average citizen to conduct themselves in ways which are appropriate not only to their profession, but to their own personal moral compass, and to what they think is the appropriate way for people to behave and to be moral actors in their occupation and in their lives. Oh, I would say one other thing I think is important.
Sure.
I felt very sorry for Governor Dukakis when he ran for president on the Democratic Party years ago, when a reporter asked him, Governor Dukakis, who are your heroes? And he had a very difficult time answering that question. And that bothered me, because I thought at least he could say my wife, or my children, or the janitor that comes in every day to my office and empties my waste paper basket, the guy who always shows up at 8 o'clock and never goes home until 5, the people that do their bit every single day, 7, 24, 365. He could have said stuff like that. He could have said something like that, and he didn't. So I'm wondering about him, why he had that difficulty. So that's one thing that I think is important. Another thing that I find particularly intriguing is for those people who have virtually no social stability as children growing up. They come from broken homes. There's basically maybe a female-based household, yet somehow they become hugely successful, and they become willing to donate a lot of their resources to help other people. And invariably, somewhere along the line, they have a mentor. They have a teacher, a clergyman, a friend, an adult of some kind who takes them under their wing and just provides a little bit of stability. It doesn't take a whole lot, but it requires a little bit. And those people who come from nothing and are hugely successful and donate to the world are my real heroes.